wasn't a part of it, at least not in that particular popularized form of it. The young guns wouldn't really know, and given its far lesser popularity at the time, perhaps relatively few people really know that Gamergate TM is not the first app Gamergate. I don't mean in terms of small-time affairs that happen in the day-to-day lives of people, but rather as full-blown gaming industry-wide concerns about, in particular, racism, sexism and bigotry in the gaming industry. Way back in the late 1980s through the 90s, the issues were raised as they related to AD&D in particular, and role-playing games more generally. I'm going to focus on AD&D for a variety of reasons. It's what most of my personal experience was. It was by far the most popular RPG at the time, and it was then and still is now in a meaningful sense the standard bearer for the industry. In some ways not even just the RPG gaming industry, but of the far broader gaming industry as a whole. The issues ought be familiar to folks these days. The portrayal of women in games was problematic. The themes of the games didn't appeal well to women. Representations of different cultures and races were lacking. The staff making the materials were not diverse enough. The gaming groups were not diverse enough. I don't think all the specifics really needs be explained, as folks are likely aware of the issues at this point. The issues surrounded especially the products of AD&D, AD&D 2nd edition, and a bit later on the introduction of D&D 3rd edition. Coming at this from a retrospective perspective, that is, listening to Gamergate TM stuff as an outsider to it, but also as someone who is very familiar with the points being discussed, some things struck me as a bit odd, rather strikingly different and not in a good way with how this particular iteration of the Gamergate TM issues unfolded. The harassment, the death threats, and so forth, that was new and pretty terrible, and noteworthy in that those kinds of things simply didn't happen, or at any rate not to the scale that they happened back then. Perhaps merely more for lack of the medium within which to do so, IDK. But it is noteworthy. Still, those aren't exactly the differences I wanted to get at here. I'm generally on the side of inclusion. Back in the day I would have been called an SJW, actively seeking to include women, queers, and folks of all racial and ethnic backgrounds in gaming. But in the more recent iterations of it I am finding something in particular missing from that side of the issues, a notable difference that, oh, let's be bold and say triggers me in a way that I wasn't at all so triggered back in the day, a striking lack of interest in the game as it is, and an active kind of hatred being expressed towards it. The motivational structure behind the talking points, near as I can tell, comes across as a fight to change the gaming culture, rather than a fight to be included within the gaming culture. The former places as enemy the existing gaming culture, the latter places them as allies, whereby the simple inclusion of folks within it is sufficient for their voices to be heard. Back in the olden times, when my lady friends spoke to me about wanting to be included in the gaming groups, and spoke openly to me about what they liked or disliked about the scene, there wasn't an expression of undergirding hatred involved. There was a sense of appreciation and interest. Like, hey, that looks fun, can I play too? To which, maybe not surprisingly, I said sure. Consequently we could joke and talk, listen to each other about the issues, and work together to address the concerns. Yes, there was sexism in the game, look at the way women were portrayed. Yes, the themes were very masculine-oriented, but that wasn't sexism, that was who the game was targeted at and who was playing at the time. Ladies want to play now too, cool. How would you like to switch things up, add to the game's fun, and make it more enjoyable for everyone? The tone, the reality of it all was quite different. Again, perhaps in no small part due to the medium. It was person to person, gaming groups making choices as gaming groups to actively seek out and include women and to diversify along other metrics. There wasn't really much in the way of a hate element involved. How can I be clear on that point, I wonder? Take the talking points of the average gamergater TM. Those folks existed back then, tbh I share some of their concerns, then and now. I loved my hobby as it was. I enjoyed the elements of it all. But, even when we sat down with such folks and talked about things, there wasn't a sense of hatred from them. Nor again, in regards to the more militant feministas out there, when they were expressing interests in joining the hobby. At any rate, they were kind. They may have expressed things forcefully, but there wasn't a sense of actual hatred stemming from them. I do not get that sense from Gamergate TM people on either side. There's fine people on both sides to misuse and abuse a poorly used and out-of-place phrase. Why to so use? To trigger folks here on both sides. Nazis either way, these folks are not. Or at any rate, back in the day I am speaking of, they were not. There simply wasn't the hatefulness involved to make it thusly. There is something odd in the currents on these points. It's literally just a game. There is a kind of misplaced seriousness that is given to it, both in regards to folks criticizing it and in regards to folks criticizing the criticizers. There is a sense that folks are wanting to take the gaming aspects as if they were actual stand-ins for the real world. There is something thoroughly odd about the disposition. On the one hand, there are folks who see the portrayal of women in games and conclude that that is how men actually think of women. There is a theoretical line being drawn between the fantasy portrayal of women in games and the modality whereby women are portrayed and thought of IRL. A concern that a divide is being jumped, or that lessons are being learned via the games, or that the games are directly reflective of something deeper than fantasy. It's remarkably unclear to what extent any of that really happens. Like, as a dude and long-time gamer guy, I don't personally make such confused positions of fantasy and reality. I may appreciate a lady dressed up in some sexualized fantasy manner or another. I may indulge in even highly sexualized fantasies of women, indeed, of people, and make play with it all in a fantasy game. But I am not so confused about reality as to think that all bitches be hoes because of it. The fantasy of it is just that. Even when taken to the point of jumping the divide, I assume my ladies be jumping that divide with me, and themselves enjoy the sexualized nature of the fantasy enough to play along without being reduced to it. The concern, and I'd suspect the hatred thereof, stemming from the assumption that women are being reduced to it. Which IDK that they really are or not anymore TBH. The concerns of it all being folks who in fact do reduce women to exactly the tropes in the fantasies of gaming. Which I am sure that happens, but the questions of pertinence are, does that have anything at all to do with gaming, and what are the discourses and proper ways of treating these issues? What I'm trying to say is that while there are certainly some number of people who reduce women to sexualized objects, I am far and away less certain that such is the case in the gaming culture at large. I am way less certain that there is anything akin to a meaningful correlation, let alone a causative effect, between gaming and reducing women to sexualized objects, nor for that matter, various racist aspects of things IRL. Moreover, I am also trying to say that I don't think that the manner that folks were discussing it in Gamergate TM was helpful to handling the issues. Not only the issues of sexism and racism, but the issues of inclusiveness and diversity as a whole. Oddly enough, the mere presence of sexualized women in gaming doesn't indicate that there is any real issue. Much of the discourse in Gamergate TM as initial criticism of the gaming industry seems to be confusing this point rather radically so. And this seems to be about where we are at these days. Sexualized men. Men are sexualized, it's true. They are too in gaming. They ought more be so IRL. But they aren't only sexualized, and that is supposedly at any rate the fine thing. I'm not really interested in the strange takes on sexualized men actually being men's fantasies of themselves either. It isn't that such isn't necessarily the case, it is that even if it were the case, the reason for that fantasy is likely stemming from women's desires for men, in much the same way that women's fantasies of themselves oft enough stems from men's fantasies of them. That is sorta exactly the kind of thing we'd expect with a sexualized species, and I don't think that it is particularly a bad thing either. Sexualization of a sexualized species sounds about perfect TBH. Avoiding the sex-negative views is something of a hobby of mine too, and ought also be yours, winky face. The point here is that in the gaming industry, women being sexualized isn't the same kind of argument that it used to be. It used to be that in D&D women were reduced to sexualized objects, tropes instead of women, and nothing more. Or at any rate, a little else. That was the complaint, and that seemed like a legitimate concern. After all, only women who are looking to be sexualized would want to play in such a game. But some women do actually like being sexualized. Indeed, most women, like most men, like being sexualized. The question ought not be, does the game sexualize, but rather, are there other aspects to the game aside from mere sexualization? Moreover, we might do well enough to expand that and hold that the issues are not, does this fantasy game use tropes, because of course it does. But rather, are the tropes used diverse enough? In the gaming industry more broadly still, the question is likely not, does this or that particular game use a trope, sexualize someone, have the proper representation, etc., but rather, are there plenty of games that don't use that trope, that don't sexualize someone, and that have proper representation? This, I think, begins to explain some of the reactions that folks are experiencing from the most current iterations of Gamergate TM. I watched a little series by Innuendo Studios talking about Gamergate TM in which they characterized the average Gamergater TM as Angry Jack, giving a supposed psychological explanation for their disposition. It wasn't altogether terrible, but it really wasn't. But it was remarkably condescending to men. It assumes outright that there is actually no possible argument, no possible way that these people might be responding to something in a, let's say, reasonable sort of way. That is, it assumes outright that there is nothing at all to what these people are saying, and therefore there must just be some kind of deep psychological phenomenon that provides a proper explanation for all their behavior. They are wrong, they are clearly wrong. Innuendo is insinuating without outright saying it, therefore there must be something wrong with them. But Angry Jack might be angry because there is actually something to what they are angry about. What might that thing be? There are actually a number of possibilities that are not altogether asinine. Some of which have to do with the issues themselves, others with the overall environment. Firstly, Angry Jack is a part of a group that is regularly targeted with exactly these kinds of claims. They are labeled the bad guys regardless of anything they may have personally done, to be clear. This point is similar to issues related to privilege, but isn't really the same kind of thing. The point here is that folks in the targeted group may simply be fed up with the overall discourse that places the blame for things upon them, often enough in a very personal manner, but even if not in a personal manner, as a group. Regardless of the claim's validity as a group, simply in virtue of being targeted as a group repeatedly is a not particularly surprising reason why someone in that group might be angry, frustrated, or lash out. There needn't be any particularly deeper explanation to it, I mean. Since, unfortunately, a good number of folks will be triggered out to no end over this point, I will restate it to hopefully head off any asinine retorts. The point I am making isn't about the validity of any criticisms or claims. It isn't about whether there is or isn't sexism, racism, etc. in gaming. It isn't about if the men's responding in anger are justified or not in that anger or their response. It is simply this. It is reasonable to respond in anger to folks consistently screaming at you, blaming you, criticizing you, etc. There needn't be anything further to the point as to why Angry Jack might be angry. No deep psychobabble rationale, just a basic, you are screaming at me, so I screamed back. For Angry Jack, listening to Angry Jill lends itself to lashing out at some point. The angry feminist, online screaming about all the things, justly or not, still will tend to lead to their targets getting angry. Again, this would be true regardless of the validity of any of the claims, regardless of status of privilege, regardless of sex, gender, etc. When you are targeted by consistent harassment, I say with some bit of irony to it, one might expect a kind of angry response. As this little piece is displaying to folks, perhaps reminding them, perhaps informing them for the first time, this is hardly the first go around on these particular issues. Folks within the gaming communities have listened to these kinds of complaints literally for decades now, and moreover, they have tried repeatedly to actually address them. I want to make that point super clear. The complaints have been listened to, heard, and action done specifically to address the concerns multiple times already. Oft these days it is the case that we are playing in games that are actually the product of those previous iterations whereby men and women talked it out and worked something out together in a way that was equitable for everyone's concerns. To hear it come again sounds a lot like a breaking of a previously agreed upon solution and has a significant ring of control to it. This point is vague because there was of course no ironclad written agreement on these things, but rather, there was a significant shift in the culture, shifts in the actual products so produced, and shifts in the attitudes and game styles played round the gaming tables. Women simply are not merely reduced to sexualized objects in D&D or the gaming industry at large anymore, nor are they generally limited to the OIDK, the expected tropes of femininity. Actions were taken and changes were made decades ago. There was an understanding that was reached by women and men on the matter, real-world discussions that happened at gaming groups and at the headquarters of the gaming industry. To have the issue raised again at best starts to sound tone-deaf, at worst it sounds like betrayal. In either case, it sounds like something someone might get angry about with some good cause to it. I want to dig in on that aspect a bit. Namely, the aspect of breaking agreements. Understanding again that we are speaking of something more ephemeral like cultural agreement than a piece of paper in writing. There is a tactic of note that this kind of behavior, breaking of agreements, that is, reminds me of. First, one makes an agreement with or without intent to maintain it. It is an agreement that is satisfactory to everyone involved but doesn't give anyone everything they want. As to why not, I mean, because lots of reasons, because there may be mutually exclusive ones. Because some wants may not be good or viable. Because some wants may be unreasonable. Because some wants were negotiated away in favor of more desirable wants or needs, something done by everyone involved. Because a negotiation involves multiple parties. Regardless of the exact reasons, such is often the nature of an agreement between folks. In this case, the case of AD&D back in the 90s, the broad understanding was something like, add women, girls, and minorities, don't get rid of what is already there. Scantily clad women of any size and color, yes please. But not merely scantily clad, capacity to do more than merely be sexualized, be the tropes, etc. Note, this is actually a deliberately sparse representation of the agreements and discussions that took place intended to poke at the feministas out there. Don't take the bait for once. After the agreement is made, the products produced, the goods gained from it, the position solidified, one then reopens negotiation on the matter. Now the position is different, the aims are different. Specifically, the aims are to go after the things folks didn't get the first go around. Now, the issues involved are pretty significant at that point. Many of those things that someone didn't get are things that are big deals. That is why, after all, there were no goes then, and why there are no goes now. So, in current for instance, there are strikingly odd claims that boys seeing scantily clad women are going to grow up to treat women poorly. Boys that play fighting games are going to grow up fighting, expressing toxic masculinity, and so forth. These were the sorts of claims that back in the day I, and many like me, looked at with a rather apt queer ass eye and thought, do these people even understand what it's like being a guy? Like, do they really and truly think that because a guy sees scantily clad women, they will therefore treat women poorly? More troubling in some sense, do they think that being sexualized is a bad thing? Are these the sex-negative types? Do they think that boys play fight and then can't distinguish between the reality of a video game fighting and the real world? How dumb do they think boys are? To which, in the 90s the response was, look lady loves, I want you to play the games too. I am happy to make space for you at the table. What you like? It's a fantasy game, or what are your fantasies, dears? How can we make the game good for you too? But I got these other players at the table, I asked them the same kinds of things. If your fantasy is about controlling their fantasies, well, that's a bit of a problem. You see, your complaint is that in effect they are controlling your capacity to have fantasies at the gaming table by telling you that girls can't do that, which is bunk. But here you are telling me that I ought to tell the boys that they can't fantasize about women in this or that way, and that there are certain fantasies the boys have that are violent and that ought not. Which is also bunk. Moreover, your reasoning for why actually makes me worry. Can you distinguish fantasy from reality? When you see the things, are the things actually the extent of your thinking? When you play fight, do you therefore go out and start randomly fighting people? Do you become more violent? When you see the sexualized women and men, do you thereby behave more sexually, imitating them, becoming them? Are you lovely ladies sure that that is the kind of criticism you want to come at me with? To which the ladies then said, that's fair, sorry we asked. Let's play. To continue on the point of the tactical concern, a renegotiation can have its place. If there is something legitimately unfair about the previously negotiated status, we might expect that there ought to be another go-round the negotiating table. If there isn't, however, then the tactic becomes perverse. A negative to the overall structure. To bring it back up incites a kind of response that is undesirable, because to renegotiate on the point is to make something worse than what it is. Less absolutist in form, to renegotiate may amount to a kind of undue power grabbing. Oft it entails a reneging on the previous agreement in a wide variety of ways, and it almost always entails the potential for a total revoking of the previous agreement as a consequence. This is the kind of concern I typically have with it. It is an attempt to get at things that were deemed not worthwhile to get in the previous go-around. To maintain all that was negotiated for that they want, as if that were the new normal, and then add to it something else that was negotiated away in order to obtain the new normal in the first place. In the instances under scrutiny here, I think that a large part of the concern is the supposed toxic masculinity culture, the conflating of certain cultural practices and certain representations of those practices, as if they were standing causes of certain bad behaviors. Play fighting leads to real fighting. Sexualized women lead to sexual assaults of women. Violent video games lead to real-world violence. Big trucks, rural life, manly men, etc. lead to violence against women, or violence in the world more broadly. I don't take these things to be true. Indeed, I take them to be gross categorical errors in thinking. I am remarkably doubtful that there is a real identifiable toxic masculinity or toxic femininity that manifests itself because of some kind of cultural practice. My intuition on the matter, and it is something of an intuition, is that the undesirable behavior of women and men, what folks refer to as toxic behavior, is something that occurs regardless of the cultural practices within which they are embedded. A bit more hopefully to put that, it is something that occurs more as a matter of individual circumstances than because of broad cultural practices. Just note for instance that these kinds of behaviors occur in all cultures throughout all of history. This despite the power structures involved, the details of the culture, the level of education, etc. Now, broad cultural practices can facilitate or not those individual circumstances, but the relevant proximate cause is the individual circumstances, not the cultural practices. This distinction is important. Please make note of it in your head. To be super blunt about it, play fighting is a wonderful mode for boys and girls to play. It is not a proximate cause for violence, it is quite plausibly a mode for girls and boys to get their anger out, release that fighting spirit, learn self-discipline, and so on. Play fighting doesn't facilitate violence, it relieves violence by providing a healthy outlet for it. More than that though, it is just plain fun. Now, it is the case that play fighting can train for real fighting. But that training is not necessarily indicative of anything like a facilitating of real violence. We do have folks that literally train to do real violence, that is, malicious, or army training, but then, these folks are at least not trying to play pretend with it all. Their motives are markedly different. Video games, violence does not cause. Similarly, sexualized women, sexual violence does not cause screaming at someone for years, indeed decades about this shit that may actually cause a violent reaction though. Which ought surprise no one, but somehow is a big shocker to many folks. Hitting someone repeatedly does entail getting hit back at some point. To head off the claim of victim blaming, I reiterate, hitting someone repeatedly, harassing them consistently, does entail a retort eventually. These are significant differences in understandings regarding the nature of the situation we find ourselves in. The point here, for this little piece, is to note that the response to feminism, going after the gaming community, ought to be understood in this context. It isn't a new talking point. The issues being raised are not new. The problem with that being, were they already addressed? I know for a fact that major efforts were made to address it. Massive cultural efforts on the part of lots of people doing so in gaming groups roundtables for decades, and efforts made at the highest levels of the gaming industry. In technical terms, for the Gamergate TM controversy, the relevance for, say, the harassment that the women involved went through is, it isn't happening in isolation. These were not the first women to speak about it, and then a rush of men randomly came after them. These were the billionth women to raise these points and pretend that no one has ever listened to them before. To pretend that they are raising salient issues, being radical or edgy, that they are transgressing some forbidden aspect of gaming culture that all the dim-witted boys have yet to hear, listen to, respond positively to, and pretending they haven't already made changes at the literal direction of women too. How many feminist zombies out there role-playing out a gender war that was over before they were even born? Thirdly, have the issues really been addressed or not? This dovetails with secondly, and is technically a technical question, but not practically one. That is, technically we can quantify this in some ways. A bit grossly but aptly, we can take a survey of the games and determine the quantities of this or that category of game representation in games, or movies, or jobs in general, etc., and we can say something like they ought to be roughly comparable to the percentages of the population. However, this masks so many aspects that I don't think folks really appreciate. The broad groupings of people are, to be blunt, not representative of the individuals involved. There is no black man as a category. Nor is there a categorical white woman. These broad categories are sometimes useful metrics to use when looking at things in generalized ways. They reveal, for instance, systemic issues associated with race, class, gender, sexuality, etc. They can inform us on the demographics. But they have severe limitations as to what they can say about individuals within said categories. Cultures can facilitate a set of circumstances, but they do not have proximate causal effect on individuals. Broad categories represent a somewhat poorly to cultures, not relevant proximate causes as they relate to individuals. Worse than this, it is not at all clear that what folks interested in, say, diversity want is something like proportional representation. To what demographic body are we referring to for our proportional representation? In a role-playing game where the very notions involved is exactly to be able to play someone other than oneself, what sense at all would it make to have proportional representation? How would anyone measure it? Just for instance, do we include all real-world cultures? I'm certainly not opposed to doing so. I adore the notion of having that available within the RPG tabletop gaming and gaming writ large, but how does that relate to proportional representation? In regards to the portrayal of women, which women? Which cultural representation of them? In regards to the sexualization of women in gaming, to be blunt again here, women absolutely adore being sexualized. They just do, and men love being sexualized too. All rhetoric to the contrary simply does not speak to women as a category. What that rhetoric mostly speaks to are individual instances and problems with being sexualized. Inappropriate places or times of being sexualized, or merely being treated as a sexualized object, as if there were nothing else to them. The problem though is that the rhetoric and oft enough the actual actions to which people are pushing behind the rhetoric are to act as if their individual instances are indicative of a larger scale problem. That is, I was sexualized inappropriately, or even, lots of women were sexualized inappropriately, therefore, all women are sexualized inappropriately, or sexualization is a problem, or toxic masculinity is a problem, and so forth. None of that follows though. I dare say that even what sexualize appropriately and sexualize inappropriately mean are so culturally defined that the notion smacks hard of cultural colonialism to the point of disgust. That is, the claims being made are claims predicated upon a very narrow and specific, oft sex-negative viewpoint as to what constitutes being sexualized appropriately. It is enough to give me serious pause in regards to how seriously I take the folks bringing these issues up. Let's put that in a different light, in a different set of problems. Just because there is a problem with crime doesn't entail that the system in place is necessarily causing that crime. Crime, in other words, may simply be a thing that happens independent of the systemization, the generalization. Now, see the moneyless free labor society's piece for an argument as to how the current systemization does actually cause crime and more broadly facilitate criminality. But even there, of course, it is unclear to what extent it is causing crime. Crime may indeed just be a thing that happens. Likewise, violence may just be a thing that happens. I digress. To reaffirm the point, these kinds of concerns can technically be quantified to determine if the issues have been addressed, but the pragmatics of doing so are odd. How we count this or that may differ, indeed, they almost certainly differ, and there isn't likely a really correct answer to be had. Is it the number of games of a certain sort? Is it access to games of a given sort? Is it the popularity of games of a given sort? Is it the sales values of games of a given sort? What sorts are we even ultimately talking about? Games targeted towards girls? Or towards boys? What does that really mean? Do we target the selling of games that are for boys to girls to be inclusive? Like, hey sweet Jane, you can be a war hero too. Or do we mean, make games that affirm girliness, like, hey Jane, here is your makeup application game? What constitutes appropriate sexualization? What cultures ought we represent? What does proportionality really entail? It's easy enough to say sure to those please, but then, again, the quantification of it becomes a mess, and so the question of have these things been done becomes very difficult to answer. Perhaps the better phrasing of it is, are these things generally being done, rather than any particular end point of quantification? To which the answer is a yes, emphatically yes, they have been done for decades now, almost literally for the entirety of the existence of the gaming industry. Hence, we again get a sense of why Jack might be angry about something substantive. Which, recall, is among the points of this little piece, explaining why Angry Jack might actually be angry beyond the strange psychobabble of reasons that are in the current discourse. If the things have been being done for many a year now, for decades now, then where is the complaint? Why the complaint? What the complaint? I am reminded of an event in my life back in the 90s. A show came out called Dark Angel, basically about a superhero action lady. When my mom heard of it, watched maybe an episode of it with me, she remarked, "Oh, another superhero action lady show." The point not being, oh my, why do we even need this, but rather, even for her such things were way old news. Those kinds of shows have been around for a long-ass time already. They aren't edgy and there isn't any real opposition to them. They are generally popular kinds of shows and there is no shortage of them. The problem may very well be something that is stemming from treating them as if they were edgy, as if they were novel, new, as if there was a transgressive fight to be had there, when in point of fact your great-grandparents already did that shit. It ain't new, missy, you ain't edgy, and it isn't an issue save perhaps that you are making it one. The point to be clear here is that Jack may be angry because there is no real issue there, but it is being brought up as if there were a real issue. When at first, second, third, fourth, fifth time Jack responded, he responded politely, helpfully, willingly looking to make a difference for those who brought it up. At the nth iteration of that, Jack got fucking angry. No surprises there, no weird psychological mumbo-jumbo going on, no concern about privileges being taken away, no secret neo-Nazi agenda, no toxicity on Jack's part at all, just a please shut the fuck up and play your little games, missy. Fourthly, the emotion of loss. This is something that is pretty wildly in the current, the remake. The changing out of some standard figure for some other figure. The race trading, or gender swapping of characters in existing stories. This honestly seems just strange to me, quite possibly counterproductive too. But here I want to address the emotional aspect of it. There is a loss involved. It isn't particularly profound, it isn't wrapped up in some strange psychobabble about privilege or fear of the other, or deep-seated political mumbo-jumbo, it is just about loss. The loss of some icon, some childhood figure, some fantasy, some dream, something. To be in grief over loss of something. It doesn't really matter if it is childish or not, the point is to understand the why are masses of people actually angry over race swapping, or gender swapping or resexualizing existing characters. One needn't be racist, or sexist, or a bigot to look at it and think, well, what about my hero or heroine? Just that kind of gut punch that takes your breath away. It's the kind of thing that does pass with time, but also leaves a scar. I think like a lot of folks on this issue, I tend towards the view that it's kinda lazy, that it's somewhat dismissive of minorities, women, and queers, and doesn't do anything helpful. A queer indigenous woman Superman doesn't really do anything aside from take away the classic Superman. Maybe worse still, the rationale for doing so seems rather off, are there not other representations already in the media? To be clear on that point, the legitimate rationale for doing something like race swapping, gender swapping, or resexualizing an existing character is that by doing so we are thereby increasing the diversity. That, however, is remarkably unlikely to be happening by doing so if there are other existing characters that have those relevant traits. Worse still, it isn't as if the existing characters don't also add to the diversity themselves. Though on that point I'd caution that strictly in terms of diversity, providing that there are other characters of the relevant sort, there isn't an actual loss of diversity. Simply taking them away isn't going to increase diversity in any direction you look at it. All it does is give a gut punch to folks that adore those characters. It seems dismissive in that it passively holds that minorities, women, and queers got nothing to add. That there are no cultures there, no ideas there, nothing there really but a desire to be like Superman. Which is pretty sad and also not true. It's lazy because of course there is very little effort involved in doing so, that is, very little creative effort. Symbolically I'd add that it looks a lot like what one would expect from a lame-ass power-grabbing exercise. Note this is remarkably different from expanding an existing franchise. The new Star Wars and Star Trek series that are more diverse are not race, gender, or sexual swapping existing characters, they are adding into themselves a more diverse grouping. To which I say, sounds good. Regardless of how I may feel about the individual efforts, there are some poor quality examples of this sort of stuff out there. I've no issues whatsoever with the adding of a more diverse cast to the effort, shitty though the effort or product may be. Contrast this with folks holding that there are some types of characters, really types of people, that simply ought not exist because they are toxic. Rather than seeking to add to the cast of characters, join a franchise, or add to the overall narratives by including whole other cultures and peoples, they seek to eradicate certain types and replace them with other types. I'd dare note that folks ought not construe that as a statement on the white replacement theory. For folks holding to this kind of supposition that there is a toxic type of character they want to get rid of and replace with some supposed non-toxic type of character, Superman isn't just a character who has this and that trait, much like too many other characters. For them Superman is irredeemable, there is something outright wrong with Superman as a character, and there is therefore also something wrong with the people who idolize Superman, or who emulate Superman in thus and such a sort of ways. For these kinds of folks, Diet Superman isn't merely an adding to the cast of characters, Diet Superman is a making right of a character who was inherently wrong. Hence there is no room in the cast for Superman, merely for Diet Superman. Reaffirming the point here, in asking such things as, why might Jack be angry, or more aptly and broadly put, what is motivating the average gamergater TM to feel the way they are feeling, rather than resort to overly complex supposed psychological analysis of power and various desires to hang on to personal privileges and so forth, we might far more simply note that there is an emotional loss that happens when folks swap out their favorite figures for something else. There is a not surprising loss that occurs howsoever you do so, and I would here note well that we don't have to do so. Doing such swaps is a deliberate choice of action towards the aims, noble though they may be, of adding to the diversity of the cast. The rationale folks are using on either side to justify their actions is just terrible though. Fifthly, are there real problems? This is perhaps the most controversial point, but it is worth mentioning. If there simply are not real problems, if, that is, the criticisms being leveled against the gaming industry are not valid, it can be reasonable to be angry at someone for screaming about them. Although this is somewhat similar to issues 2 and 3, it differs meaningfully in that it is holding that some of the claims being leveled are simply not valid. They never needed to be redressed. No matter the feelings of the people involved, either the facts of the matter or the ethics of the matter just don't pan out the way the critics of gaming are saying that they do. This gets into pretty dicey waters, plus it amounts to some serious questions as to what constitutes sexism, misogyny, misandry, racism, and bigotry. Each of these being rather contentious issues. I want to try and provide what I take to be a good faith effort to explain why and how these are contentious issues at all. Each of these broad categories has a real counterpart to whatever it is that the gentler readers may have in mind. There is, in other words, such a thing as misandry, despite there being a concern about misogyny. Racism is a human problem and not a problem we find in white people, despite all the rhetoric that may suggest otherwise. Bigotry occurs rather surprisingly regardless of the sexual dispositions of people. This point is important as it entails that folks can go too far with even a valid concern. In other words, it is entirely possible to notice a real concern of some sort to the portrayal of women in AD&D products, and one can overcorrect it by snuffing out the trope portrayals of women in the genre. Or by clamoring that any sexualized portrayal of women is a bad. Or by claiming that there is something inherently wrong with men dripping with misandry here. The more savvy readers ought be able to draw that out to the other kinds of concerns. Among the more obvious sorts of solutions that was offered and done was simple inclusion and diversification. Other cultures were included in the settings, the non-white skin colors were included, and women were included quite regularly and given a plethora of options as to whom they play. Oft enough the game itself was modified to accommodate for the various stated needs, wants and desires of folks, maybe especially women, but also significant efforts in regards to including a wide variety of different cultures. Not merely within AD&D but across the tabletop RPG gaming industry, and indeed, across the video game industry. Is there really a problem now? Is the big-breasted Brazilian lady actually a problem? The hulking muscular big black man a problem? The wild white whiskied up ballet-dressed barbarian a problem? The brazenly back-skinned native babe a problem? Were any of these ever really a problem? I want to be uber clear about the point here that these things ought not be a problem as they constitute the fantasies of a diverse grouping of peoples. What is a problem is if various of these fantasy figures are snuffed out at the whim of peoples to whom they are not fantasies. There is an interesting and I think fruitful real-world analogy to the signs of racism. The flags of outright racists. The notion of whose whims do we listen to in terms of if to sunset them or not. Now, this analogy only really goes so far, but I think this is the intuition folks are using when they are holding that there is something wrong with someone else's fantasies. Specifically, the claims are likely running as follows: that trope is racist, or sexist, or bigoted in thus and such a way, and therefore it is just like the racist flags. Because they are like the racist flags, we ought to listen to the whims of those whom are hurt by those flags, and hence, we ought not fly those flags. This is somehow a sound intuition regarding the racist flags. Note that the supposition as to why not to fly them is not that the flying of them causes racism. Pretty sure racism was a thing long ways prior to the flags. Moreover, unlike the flags, the fantasy tropes do not carry a comparable meaning of offense. They do not stand in for racism, or sexism, or bigotry. They are not, in other words, flags or otherwise symbols of racism, sexism, bigotry, etc. To be blunt, the brazenly dark-skinned native babe is not a racism or a sexism. It is a tropey fantasy figure for sure, but they all are. Perhaps more telling is that the actual trope has some sense of history to it, and some sense of in particular Native American fantasy element to it that is potentially enjoyable for Native Americans or others to play. Indeed, in the playing of them thereby being exposed to them, perhaps for the first and only time in their lives, which is supposed to be part of the joyfulness and the goodness of the game. It is, in other words, extremely awkward to make such things awkward. It is holding to an odd and extremely dubious position that one ought to police one's fantasies, one's fantasy figures for such concerns not of racism, but of race. Not of sexism, but in concern of sexuality. That hulking big black man is a fantastical fantasy, but it is a fantasy. Is there really a problem with the fantastical fantasy figure? Does the fantastical fantasy figure of the wild white whiskied up barely dressed barbarian really cause any problems? Representations matter, of this I am fairly positive all readers but the most heinous can agree. But then, there has to actually be that representation. What happens when that brazenly dark-skinned babe is outlawed for the cause of policing fantasy? To be clear again, that trope has real history to it, and was a real style. If it has been misused in some ways over the years, is the answer to outlaw the style? If so, wouldn't you be an outlaw by preference? At times the look of anger upon the faces of folks screaming for the removal of tropes in the name of purifying fantasy causes me serious pause. To what exactly is it that there is such anger about? Who responds to the portrayal of peoples from different cultures that way? Who looks with such hatred upon visuals of others very other-tanoized? Who gets to say? Again, to continue with the example of the flag, we defer to the feelings and nothing more of those who are victims of the racisms represented by those flags for good cause. But here we simply are not speaking of such things. The questions really are, who gets to police whose fantasies? This is where so much of the argument by those criticizing RPGs and gaming industries just utterly falls apart. What right do they have to police other people's fantasies? And to be clear, this isn't a case of mutual policing either. This is blatantly a policing of men's fantasies, men's thoughts, men's cultures, and oft enough more specifically straight white men. Beyond the rights to police it, we ought seriously question the validity of the critiques. Odd it is, so very odd and off it is, to hear others inform me what a trope or fantastical image means to me. I cannot adequately express how utterly false such claims are, at least most of the time. When I place something within the fantastical realms, it oft enough does have some kind of symbolic meaning. This is true. Rare, very, very rare is it the case that someone guesses at what that meaning really is. The meanings ascribed, the rationales given for those ascriptions are oft highly idiosyncratic to my life within the context of my culture, but culture is not a proximate cause for individual actions. Culture provides a context whereby those images and fantastical fantasy figures may stem from, but regardless of their stemming, their meaning actually arrives upon my doorstep via the individual circumstances of my life. Not that of the culture writ large, nor the origin of the figure. To address the orcs in the room, for instance, the orcs may actually have had some kind of racist origin to them within, that is, the mind of their creator. Maybe, maybe not. Regardless, that is not how they were introduced to me, and it was not how they were ever used. They simply no longer had that meaning associated with them. They are not a racist flag. The scantily clad lady carries a certain obvious sexualized tone, but what that sexualized tone incurs to it varies from culture to culture, and indeed, from individual to individual. In other words, I do not reduce women to the meanness of sexuality, even though I sexualize women, and even though the scantily clad ladies of fantasy are exactly that, sexualized. I assume of those fantasy women, in other words, more to them than merely the sexualized aspects. Why? Perhaps because something was done to address that many decades ago, and it just isn't the edgy issue that folks seem to think it is. What I hear these days regarding the scantily clad ladies of fantasy sounds like prudishness, sounds, in other words, like sex negativity more than anything else. Sounds like folks terrified of being sexualized, folks that are disgusted with sexualization, sex, the human body, dislike human touch, etc., maybe especially if that is coming from a gasp man. The modern, little underpants man, with an unsurprising gender change to them. In the first iteration of Gamergate TM, that was a no-no, and understood as a no-no by everyone involved. In these latest iterations of Gamergate TM, such appears to be the entire point. A Victorian kind of colonialistic attitude that holds to hammer down upon sexual expression that is not of their liking, especially sexual expressions that come from the menses. This sort of prudishness holds to the notion that any such sexualization ought happen only on a woman's terms. Coded talk for the policing of thought, the policing of fantasy, and ultimately a policing of masculine sexuality. Any wonder at why it is that some folks might be a bit off-put by it? I want to reiterate the experience of the 90s Gamergate TM, as I think this really sums up the point and the questions in the current. To which, in the 90s the response was, look lady loves, I want you to play the games too. I am happy to make space for you at the table. What you like? It's a fantasy game, or what are your fantasies, dears? How can we make the game good for you too? But I got these other players at the table, I asked them the same kinds of things. If your fantasy is about controlling their fantasies, well, that's a bit of a problem. You see, your complaint is that in effect they are controlling your capacity to have fantasies at the gaming table by telling you that girls can't do that, which is bunk. But here you are telling me that I ought to tell the boys that they can't fantasize about women in this or that way, and that there are certain fantasies the boys have that are violent and that ought not. Which is also bunk. Moreover, your reasoning for why actually makes me worry. Can you distinguish fantasy from reality? When you see the things, are the things actually the extent of your thinking? When you play fight, do you therefore go out and start randomly fighting people? Do you become more violent? When you see the sexualized women and men, do you thereby behave more sexually, imitating them, becoming them? Are you lovely ladies sure that that is the kind of criticism you want to come at me with? To which the ladies then said, that's fair, sorry we asked. Let's play. Do we or no? Multiculturalism, Storyteller Mode. Let me put all these points a bit differently. Is it worthwhile or not to diversify an existing cultural expression? And if so, what does that look like? How ought it be done? Here I mean like if there is a Japanese cultural expression. It exists. Is there worth in introducing racial, cultural, gendered, or sexual swaps within it? And let me put it in a future-looking perspective. To what does a legitimately multicultural human expression look like? Is it a bunch of boxed-off cultures in image, that is, Japanese culture imagines itself as, for the Japanese, people by the Japanese? If a non-Japanese person likes the cultural expression, they see therein Japanese people and not themselves. No matter how many non-Japanese people may come to live within Japan, or to more broadly partake in Japanese culture regardless of where they live, nonetheless a proper Japanese cultural expression is peopled by Japanese folks. To do otherwise would be racist, or something. Or is it that Japanese cultural expressions are something other than merely racialized and nationalized things, and they can be applicable to folks regardless of their race or nationality, regardless of where they live, or who they are? In which case you may race swap a figure, or gender swap, mix and match cultural aspects, or sexual swap them. I don't want to suggest that not doing so is inherently racist, or even nationalistic, if there may be reasons for instance related to the aforementioned gut punch emotive effect, and concerns about maintaining some kind of cultural cohesion, and even concerns about diversity. These are all vague and ill-defined sorts of concerns, but they are valid sorts of concerns. At which point, TCS's ship style, does the culture no longer resemble Japanese culture via such swappings? When do we lose diversity by doing such swappings? When is there a desperate and valid conservative grab for the conservation of cultures? For the sake of diversity. Understand that the tools available these days that make the world so interconnected also make the world far more inherently multicultural. These kinds of swappings, well thought out or not, are happening all the time everywhere all at once. When the great eye falls. Separately, but importantly, when do we lose history by doing such swappings? Do we lose out on classic Superman because we wanted to try out Diet Superman? Does every pre-existing cultural expression needs or ought be changed? What is lost by doing so? Do we actually in the important sense lose our histories by doing so? As in, say, we misunderstand the species history by doing so. For sure the actual history will still be written down somewhere or another, but the lived history shifts, and people ultimately forget their actual history. Is that entirely bad though? I've got to say that I'm uncertain as to that point. I want to try and run through some of the possibilities of interpretation on this point, and I'll be grounding myself theoretically via the argumentation of the odd questions of privilege, a slight history of colonialism. Specifically, I am going to be holding that there is some non-trivial degree whereby the aesthetic, the stories we speak formally structure the thinking of people. That is, that whilst we may well delineate between fantasy and reality, the fantastical nonetheless exists, has ontological import to the way we think. In a significant sense, we are speaking of what Plato called the forms, the formal structure of reality. The reality of ideas as an epistemically ontic structure. To be blunt, we could in other words speak of these things in strictly scientific terms, really get to the nitty-gritty of it all, and nonetheless end up speaking of exactly something akin to the forms. The broad structures like culture and hosiness, whereby the actual thinking occurs. These are structurally formed at least in part via the stories we tell. Hence, there is a rather strikingly important aspect to the games, to ethics within games, namely, that they help to formally structure the modalities of thought that people have. Note though that this is not nearly as simplistic as present pink as girly, and thereby girly we make girls. People do not pan out so straightforwardly from the presentations that stories provide. Violent video games do not violence make. Cultures are not proximate causes of individual actions. We can speak of facilitation of this or that, and yet even there we get into the complexities of it, because a given thought doesn't translate one-to-one to anything in particular, and there are a plethora of modes of response and thoughts. The control freak thinks that there is a definite one-to-one linkage, and if there isn't they will force the issue on the back end of things, e.g. if I don't get my way, then I'll simply force the issue in the real world. Hence, there are things like laws that try to enforce aesthetical norms, or indeed, simply the use or threat of use of force, deprivation of affections, really any kind of means of control to make it happen despite the reality of the situation. In spite of the ethics of it. Here we are dealing with a multicultural reality that simply wasn't really present for most people throughout most of history. The everyday life of people now is a multicultural experience. And the questions arise as to how to realistically handle that as a matter of aesthetical consideration in storytelling mode. Note the author here is pretty certain that the fundamental involved isn't actually storytelling, but rather is temporality. The mode of relevance fundamentally is how the species thinks of and understands temporality. Temporality structures the story, not really the other way around, and temporality, we are supposing at any rate, is a real structure, not merely an imaginative one. That said, in this piece we are addressing the questions of games, the pragmatics of gaming, to what that really looks like, how story structuring actually can be effective to real-world structuring, and how to handle the transmutation of relatively isolated cultural entities into a globally multicultural one. To be blunt, some aspects of this are gendered, and there is actually a kind of value to be had by addressing these issues via gender. The rationale is that gender, sex, and sexuality are all actual aspects of all the cultures involved. There is, therefore, a good sense in which folks can communicate with each other across otherwise disparate cultural structures via the medium of gender, sex, and sexuality. These too in a manner that, say, race can't handle. Race being an inherently problematic construct, a divisive one that is quite literally and figuratively transcended via sex, sexuality, and gender. To be a race traitor is to stick it to the racists. Among the most serious of issues in the current is the degree whereby sex, sexuality, and gender as an academic pursuit are biased via the domination of the field by women and women's views on things. It is quite bad, y'all, comically so. A disturbing number of the criticisms from the red-pilled crowd have some sensicalness to them, and that is actually problematic because the red-pilled crowd also has of itself a lot of truly sexist and misogynistic shit to it. Much as the points regarding why men in particular might be angry over Gamergate TM, we might do well to look at other aspects in the real world that may be things that they are responding to. That is, it isn't rooted in misogynistic thinking, even as it produces some misogynistic results. Men are not thinking or even trying to be misogynistic, rather, they are responding to certain real things that actually threaten them. Misogyny in response to misandry, for instance. Or, as this piece has already illustrated, misogyny in response to pointless screaming. I am reaffirming these points because to properly address a global multiculturalism we cannot be so foolish as to hold to either the comically gendered biased views that are represented via the academic or pop feminism, nor the reactionary red-pilled response thereof. Each do actually tend to raise good points, but each also have pretty strong sentiments of misanthropy with a gendered flair to it. A proper multiculturalism is likely most properly understood via a gendered and sexual viewpoint, as in, what is a man has a multitude of different cultural answers to it, as much as what is a woman, and what is a queer. Each of these different cultural viewpoints are valid, again, not in the sense of, your feelings are valid, but in the sense that they constitute some reified expression of manliness, or womanliness, or queerliness, though perhaps predicated upon little more than thoughts, ideas, beliefs, and so forth. They are given manifestation via the bodies, in no small part via little more than the living of those bodies. To be as blunt as I can be on the point, to have a thought that manliness is to do thus and such, that is reified, made real, via the living of the bodies doing thus and such. There isn't another thing called manliness to it. It is manly to cook, for instance, because men cook and not really for any other reason, well, perhaps with the important precursor that someone's had the thought as such and decided to do the relevant actions. But here the thrust is to again and seriously point out that such is what constitutes gendered cultural expressions. The queers are those who take whatever the existing gendered cultural expressions are and utilize them in different ways, oft enough as they correlate, not causate, to the relevant bodies to which genders are ascribed. Again, there is no particular reason to hold the view that there is a something about the men's, the women's, and the queers as a matter of biology that casually constitutes what it means to be manly, womanly, or queerly. For sure there are some kinds of physiological realities thereof, but the point is that gendered aspects, like manly men with trucks, are clearly not biologically derived aspects of what it means to be a manly man. If folks bother to think for once in their lives, they'd realize how utterly absurd the notion would be that there is some biologically derived reason as to why it is manly to drive trucks. The queers take the culturalized gendered aspects and craft them into the relevant bodies, not man to man's body and woman to woman's body, but rather by a culturalizing of manliness, such that trucks become the manly sort of thing. Likewise, and importantly here, when it comes to multiculturalism, what constitutes manliness or womanliness has a wide variety of gendered expressions to it. While it used to be the reality that for most folks to be manly or womanly or queerly was relative to one's given culture, the local area within which they so happened to be born and reside within, now it is the case that what is manly or womanly or queerly rather radically also includes non-local areas. To give a bit in the current that is particularly sad and pathetic, the man bun, that is derisively spoken of by folks in some cultures, is actually a warrior's hairstyle in other, frankly far more powerful cultures of manliness. Likewise, long hair in some cultures is construed as feminine, in others it is understood as a mark of manly warriorness, much in the same way as a track might be. For the queers there is a kind of plethora, a time of plenty on the offering here, as to take upon oneself this or that aspect no longer is limited to the musings of one particular culture. To be queer enough to wear a man bun or to have a penis and also have long hair could be interpreted as being feminine to some, masculine to others, hyper-masculine warrior garb souped up and ready to kill to others. The interpreters in these instances, I think contrary to what folks may intuit on the matter, have a lot of importance and sway as to what those things actually pragmatically mean. But, and this is super critical to grasp at, any reductive claim to a given culture is ultimately invalid in the sense that your feelings are simply not valid. They do not hold up to scrutiny, that is, beyond a mereness of the feeling, and the feeling therefore ought not be construed as having relevance to a reification of the thought. To hold that there is a feeling of a man bun as being feminine is perhaps fine to have from some cultural perspective. Such reifies the thought within the context of that culture. However, to in any way shape or form attempt to hold that such is generally applicable beyond that particular cultural context is an utterly invalid emotive state, it ought not be reified. This goes to the point here of multiculturalization. The only possible justification one can offer is some version or another of a monoculturalist viewpoint which runs counter to the multicultural reality. This places multiculturalism as a central feature, but then, it simply holds that that is the reality. Which tbh is an uncontroversial claim to make. What the controversies tend to surround are claims that attempt to deny that reality. Putting on a piece of clothing can have meaning to me, which is fine but insufficient for reification of the meaning. In other words, such is a necessary but not sufficient condition for the piece of clothing to carry that particular meaning. Meaning is something that occurs not merely predicated upon individuals, but rather predicated upon the interactions between individuals. To hold that, this means, thus to me, is fine and dandy, but it may be little more than a dandy sort of claim. It holds tacitly or explicitly that there is no multiculturalism, there is just the cultures of one, which is really just hyper-individualism as a cultural expression. It is also, for what it's worth, very likely incoherent. Hence, we might well hold that one has a right to wear what they want, but one doesn't have the right to determine how other people interpret it. Doing so runs afoul of our premise of multiculturalism. Of course, explicitly within that is the right to wear what one wants. Any view that attempts to hold otherwise also runs afoul the multiculturalism premise. To reaffirm the example, to hold that a person of non-Japanese biological ancestry cannot wear traditional Japanese clothing is not a valid view, it doesn't deserve to be reified, because it falters on the premise of multiculturalism. Specifically, because it denies the capacity of the queers. I put it in those terms because I know for some folks that's going to be a difficult and bitter pill to swallow. By denying the capacity of the queers, they are merely attempting to reinforce a particular local manifestation of culture. They are holding to some version or another of a nationalistic narrative to the exclusion of all other nations, where nations turn into a stand-in for cultural expression rather than the super boring thing they are, meaningless scribbles on a piece of paper that are held up by the threat of violence. Similarly, to hold that a traditional Japanese hairstyle is womanly, even though it is a derivative of manliness in that culture, is to fail to adhere to the multicultural premise. Such is a bad perhaps for a variety of reasons, but here the claim is rather strikingly that such is a bad because it denies the reality. It is a bad because it is frankly delusional to the reality. As if seeing a manly man dolled up and ready to mutilate your ass, and rather than understand the reality of the situation they laugh because their hairstyle is a man bun, or long and flowing like a woman, laughing until the knife cuts it short. The one is a hyper-individualistic error to the reality. It isn't that they cannot succeed, it is that they do not really exist beyond the thought. They cannot actually reify the thought. They might try, don't get me wrong, but they will continually push up against the queers as a limit to their efforts. The queers whom, simply in virtue of their existence, fatally deny them their reality. Hence, after all, and of course, we might get a sense of why it is these folks tend to rail and rage against the queers first and foremost. The other is fascistic, nationalistic, a kind of uber-communalist impulse to force the issue, that is, to force the cultural expression at the expense of any and all that may stand against them. They too are denied their existence beyond that of a thought, denied the capacity of reification merely by the existence of the queers. They fail to reify themselves because their reification runs entirely counter to the actual reality the queers exist, and thus they do not. Hence, after all, and of course, we might get a sense of why it is these folks tend to rail and rage against the queers first and foremost. It strays a bit from the topic, but is well worth noting. The existential quality of the queers goes beyond the mereness of the concern that they exist at all, and stem into the concern that existence as such requires them. They are a part of the good insofar as the good partakes of existence. Their necessity of existence, in other words, is indicative of their goodness, in proportion to the degree that the good partakes in existence. Though one likely cannot really defeat the queers, the trying is a bad, the trying is perhaps indeed a rather strikingly big bad. And, as if railing against the necessary existence of the good, we can put all this in different terms, then hold that they each, the fascistic and the hyper-individualistic modalities, falter, fumbles and flusters themselves because there are actually different cultures. Their interpretations are wrong, and rather obviously so, because the reality is that there are actually different cultures. It is at times like watching people walk into a brick wall repeatedly with a silly smile on their faces. Nonetheless, it is the query that dances between the cultures, which moves the cultures internally, and are the crafters of the cultures at all, lest they be static to the point of death. It is the query that holds existence together. As a matter of ethics, in terms of storytelling, multiculturalism entails a capacity of the queers to pretend to be Japanese, or more broadly put, to pretend to be indigenous to this or that plot of earth relative to some particular historical period is the fucking point. To be capable of putting on this or that piece of clothing regardless of the historical time period within which one lives, and indeed, regardless of one's current geophysical location. Now, all that has to be tempered, it really does, I think, by the reality that cultures require some degree of inculcation, some degree of reification, in other words. As mentioned before, there is an actual point whereby a conservative grab for the sake of conservation of cultures is valid. Course, there are also a lot of bullshitty grabs of that sort which ought to be strongly assaulted. I'd direct folks to the odd questions of privilege, a slight history of colonialism, as that series provides a good rundown on the relevant ethics and pragmatics. Here though I'll try and sum it up fairly and neatly. Cultures require for their creation the raising of babies within them. Some degree of specification to the cultural expression. To raise a child as is a valid and perhaps even praiseworthy sort of thing to do. However, within each of those, raising a child as, the folks have to also teach to reify within the we ones that multiculturalism is a reality. That the queers are a reality. That they are not right nor wrong in their particular cultural expression to which they are being taught, but that it is a real and valid sort of cultural expression nonetheless. Understand that to not do so is to fail to reify the cultural expression. The queers will always exist, other cultures will always exist. That is just a part of reality to such an extent that if a culture fails to teach that aspect, they will also be failing to reify themselves, as the existence of the queers will always block them. To fail to teach this is also very much akin to failing to teach that the world is round. It is utterly silly in a sick sad world kind of way.
Bạn nói gì?